Hey, I'm Taylor Dorsett, and this is the Professional Technical Interviewee. Technical interviews are hard, and every company does them differently. On this show, I interview engineering leaders to see what they look for in technical candidates, and then they perform a real technical interview with me. My guest today is Sean Wolter. He's currently an engineering director at ActiveCampaign and previously worked at SpotHero, Belly, and Vokal here in Chicago. We talk about his interviewing advice, he breaks down what he's looking for in a potential hire, and in the technical, we talk about how to build a Slack coffee application. All right. Well, we are back into part two here, Sean. The ball is in your court. Let's move into the technical portion.
All right. Well, as I said, in recent experience, we've got the actual coding early on. In the interview, much more discussion, collaborative, traits and values, as I keep saying. So I will do my best to run you through a slight variation on what we've been using at ActiveCampaign. A little bit behind the scenes, our goal, whether or not we achieve that goal, but our goal is to have one exercise that sort of scales with candidates. So entry-level candidate could just sort of talk through the sort of flow and think through the implementation, while we'd expect a senior to, super senior engineer to consider edge cases, security, performance, all sorts of stuff like that in the same amount of time, because hopefully the problem scales up.
Yeah.
All right. So we've got a client calls us up and says that they want us to build a Slack app for them. They're going back to the office. Pandemic's over. They're going back to the office, and they want a Slack app that does coffee run matchmaking. So, yep. So here's a potential use case. I'm at my desk, and I'm like, oh man, I could stretch my legs. It's time to run downstairs and hit up Caribou Coffee. So I do / coffee run, and if there's anyone else that is also interested in doing a coffee run, we'll be paired up. It'll say so and so is interested, and we'll both get a message, and then we can go. Ideally, that would be MVP, and then ideally we could set a different queue length so that we could have more people going out for coffee. So say I don't want to go with one person, but I'm feeling social and I want 4 people to go out to coffee. I could say coffee run 4, and then it would wait in the background until 4 people were excited about coffee, and then we would all go together. Does that make sense, more or less?
Yes. Okay, so coffee Slack app. It's matchmaking. Basically, will pair people if multiple want to go at once. Okay, great.
So there's no need to write pseudocode, although you can if you're comfortable with it. So what I'd like to start with is just the simple sort of matchmaking, hopefully simple. A Slack bot works by sending a message to a service and then getting a response.
Yeah.
So what I'd like you to talk about is building that service such that it can get a message and then send a response. So to start, I guess, how would you approach just being able to match people up if they were both interested in making a run for coffee?
Yeah, so I think I'm assuming the Slack bot would connect to some type of API, or the Slack bot has some type of API that we can connect to through basically writing those messages, right? So if we type /coffee, then it's sending a request to this bot.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then that API, exactly, that's the key word. That API is what we're looking for you to talk through. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So API would need to take in something, right? I'm assuming the data we would want to basically pass to that API would be the kind of user ID or username, right? Some type of identifier for this user. We would also want to thinking some type of window, right? Like I'm interested within the next 30 minutes or whatever the time frame is, right? That they can go to get the coffee. I'm trying to think other key things. There's certainly potentials, right? If I'm thinking MVP, those are the absolute essentials, right? If I'm thinking MVP, it's maybe, other people I might be interested in going with, right? Like maybe I have a group of people that like the engineers I'm interested in. So I don't necessarily need to go get coffee with the marketing people I don't know, right? Or maybe it's open to everyone or just one person, right? Or a very small group of people, right? Something like that. But I think that would be less important for initial stages. And we're still going to get this coffee, so it's not like we would need to include anything coffee related, right? I don't need to say espresso in this.
Yeah, but your line of thinking is great. Yeah, to think about the customer and the implementation and how this might grow as a product.
Yeah.
But yeah, for the get-go, just want to be able to say, as you said, a username is interested in coffee. You talked about the time window, which isn't necessary for version 1, but that's a good point too. Would you imagine that as a parameter? So I would say coffee run 30, and that would be like in the next 30 minutes.
Yeah, 30 minutes like leave time as well. And I guess another key point would be, maybe there's multiple coffee houses, so I'm interested in this one specifically, or this one and, this other one. Some people may love Starbucks, but hey, Caribou and vice versa.
Yeah.
So some type of qualifier.
Yeah.
I'm trying to. Those are the things that immediately come to mind as is the key kind of data we would need to send to this.
Yeah.
Is there anything else?
No. I mean, like I said, to get started, the minimum viable, it's hardly a product, minimal viable bot is, as you touched on, just the username. I'm curious in terms of design. I don't have a strong opinion here, to be honest, but in terms of design, would you have, CoffeeBot? Would the API URL be coffeebot / join, and then the body would include the data? Or do you think, or would you rather do a more general purpose, like coffeebot / get message, handle message, something like that? Like, do you prefer it in the URL or in the sort of body of the post request? Does that make sense?
Yeah. As far as a preference, mostly just what I know is in the URL. So I think that's what I would lean towards. I think if we were trying to be, I could be wrong here, but maybe we're more secure if we're doing it in the body in some way, shape, or form. That may make it easier to scale as well, especially if we're adding multiple parameters. So we don't have a URL that's got, all these different parameters, not including marketing people, but including developers that we're interested in going to coffee with. And that would be easier to do in a body, or at least less ugly to do in a body.
And I think this is where I show my own inexperience. I think that it depends on the framework that we're using for the API as well, because some make it really easy to spin up routes, and then others make it more difficult. So then maybe there's just a path of least resistance to have one route with a bunch of different parameters versus many routes with simpler parameters.
Right.
And the security you called out, that's a good question. I should talk to our security people and see, does that make a difference? Because the URL isn't encrypted, or is it? I should learn more about HTTPS.
Yeah, I guess that depends too, right? If it's HTTPS or not. And I don't I've just been thinking of this recently. I just had a piece of functionality we took from being handled by like a PHP backend, and then we're going to pull a lot of that code into the front end, or basically having JavaScript assemble some HTML instead of having it done on the backend as a string. And after we got done kind of thinking of how to do this, my thought was, wait, now we're basically showing all of this to anyone who wants to see it, though, which I don't know if that's a security concern, but it's a hospital application, so it's something that I think I'm always aware of. How much can we, not have out on the the forefront where anyone who can, inspect Element can see everything we're doing and all the variable names, which might be useful for them if they're actually trying to do something malicious, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if we have concerns with our coffee bot about that, but
not yet. But once it takes off,
once it's our killer app,
yeah. So how do you have any bright ideas about the matchmaking? So we imagine we have the API endpoint or the route, whatever framework we're using. You get username comes in, and then how do you imagine you would sort of queue up and match people? How would you design that algorithm?
Yeah, I think it's a queue, that a priority. Well, I would say a queue, or maybe a priority queue would be using a first in, first out approach. Essentially, the people who signed up, those are the people who. If we do a priority queue, we can assume some type of priority to it, right? If you say I need to basically have coffee the next 15 minutes, right? You're going to jump to the front of the line versus someone who puts an hour in there. But still, if you signed up first, you should be a higher priority than people who have signed up later, right? At least that's my initial thought.
Would for version 1 at least, if it's just pairs, how, again, there's no right answer. I'm really showing my cards. I'm being transparent here. How fancy would you get if it's just pairs to start? Like we have one come in and then the next come in, and then they're ready to go.
Yeah, I mean that would, I guess, could be pretty straightforward, right? You could use something as simple as an array, right? Just saying if length is less than 3, right, then send it off, right? Or if length is equal to 2, then it's ready to go, right?
Oh yeah.
So as soon as someone comes in, they're kind of put in the first spot in an array. When the second person comes in, then it's good to go, and they're kind of both sent there. Your match made, right? And in theory, that could scale up to 4, right? You could have several people. Seems like it would be straightforward, right? I think if I'm really scaling it, then I want some type of priority queue tree. But I think that would work if we're just trying to get something out. If I'm the intern and I've been tasked with building this app, that's what I'm definitely using.
Yeah. That's a good point. And I think that that sort of just an array, and when we see the array get to a certain size, and say, ta-da, you're all matched, and then we send them all some sort of message. I think that scales until, as you mentioned, what if there are groups? What if there are certain restaurants? Like there's all sorts of additional buckets to worry about in the future. But for the start, I think that's good. So now if we take the array for granted and it's sort of in memory, now how do we make this highly available and fault tolerant? So what happens if we're deploying this to Kubernetes? We have this service highly available, and the service, with Kubernetes, it needs to be able to be killed and relaunched, and multiple copies of the same. So how do we make sure that, God forbid, the power goes out in the data center, we don't lose these matches, because this coffee is important.
Yeah, I guess we could. if we want to ensure that this, right, we're not all just handling this all in memory, we can do some type of database call and database storage, and write each incoming request to a database, right? Saying that this is some type of incoming request. Here's the identifier, right, that they've passed in. And again, if we want a time frame, I guess would be less critically important, right? But at least we have that they've passed that in, right? And maybe a date associated with it, right? So we know it was on this day. And that would also give us a record. We can obviously use that information to see how often our coffee app is being used, right? Versus just going, it seems like people are getting coffee together, right?
Yep. No, that's a good point. One of my canned questions is often like, let's imagine management says people must go out to coffee, and then being able to track it and keep an audit log is helpful for that that very creepy product request.
Coffee Great Brother, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's. What do you think as far as like? I guess I don't really know if we can, from an API request, we could push that directly to a database. I mean, it just depend on what database we're using and how we want to format that. But we would be able to make that request at the same time, essentially. And then we could probably update that once they get the confirmation, right, of like, this was an incoming request and this was an actual confirmed one, right? So we could have both sides of it.
So then let's poke at the problem in a different way and say this company has phenomenal growth. There's now 100,000 employees at this company, and they all want coffee. So do you imagine any odd edge cases? Again, assuming that this is just the MVP, and we're using sort of a database as a queue at this point to just sort of put in people and then match the top two, then put in the next two, match them. Do you anticipate any problems if we're getting hundreds or thousands of requests a minute?
Yeah, hopefully if we're it's some type of scalable system, then we won't have any type of I don't know, overload of our actual database, right? Hopefully. I guess we could design a database that would make sense to, if we're planning on handling hundreds of thousands of requests a day, right? Or per minute if we have a lot of employees. Potential issues apart from like people issues, right? Just the CEO's gonna match with just random people. I mean, that's its own issue, right? But I don't know, as long as we're ensuring that there's always a one-to-one match, right? There's, as soon as this is 2, it's being sent out, right? There's no issue where sometimes it's 3 or somehow 3 people are getting a message at once, which shouldn't necessarily have issues with. And there's no specific assigning of people, then we don't have to worry about one individual being with some very specific criteria being set aside and never getting matched with. I don't know if I see any immediate issues. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I'm taking, this is where the whiteboard helps, because in my mind, I'm taking for granted, I think, that we may have multiple sort of nodes that are all connected to a single database. So the database acts as the sort of the bottleneck, the concurrency limiter. Because if we had multiple ones, then you might have a request go here. Actually, no, now that I say it out loud, because if you have a request go here and a request go here, and each one is still only looking for 2 and they're not duplicated, then yeah, I guess see, it depends. It depends entirely on the setup, because
right.
If the database, what's the technical term for it? If like the database is unique, then there's no trouble. If we get into redundant databases, readers and writers and things like that, then that's a whole nother kettle of fish. But for MVP, for the supposed architecture, I really can't think of anything strange to be on the lookout for.
Good.
So let's talk a little bit about the sort of future state then. So this is a great success, and they come back and they say, we would like to be able to have preferences, and I don't want to set it every time, like say / coffee run, department, time frame, blah blah blah. I'd like persistent preferences. So in the future, when I say it's coffee time, the system just knows what I like in terms of, let's say, store, team, sort of like which department to look in. Yeah, let's just go with those two for the start for preferences.
Okay. I don't know a ton about Slack bots and if there's a way to save it on that side, but are we assuming it's going to be in basically the database is going to remember? I guess that's the question, right? Is how are we going to remember that? I don't really know enough about Slack bots to say if there's a way to auto generate that, but assuming that we're not auto generating a string based on the fact you just say coffee time, right, and it auto completes with what your normal settings are, with some Slack magic, then maybe we have some type of state that you can set, essentially, or preference that you can set as an initial variable you can pass, or at some point you can pass and you can update along with your coffee request that says like save settings or something, and then that's set in the database, and anytime it sees this unique identifier for this individual come in, it's going to look at that specific preferences and then always populate whatever their other preferences are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I was going to follow on to that to say, like, do you imagine a separate command and API? Let's assume that Slack doesn't support any state and we must implement it in our service.
Yeah.
Do you imagine a separate API, separate command that's like preferences? Or are you saying like, if a request is made, somebody could, we have the long string for your first coffee run, but then after that, those are just set as defaults.
Yeah, well, at any time you can essentially, if the string would be, coffee time, right? Whenever you want to get coffee, let's say the first time it's going to read your name and pass that in, or maybe we have to write the name ourselves, and the time frame. Those two things you always have to add, right? But you can also write /preferences and then fill out the other things. And again, this is, I'm thinking how does Slack work? /help or something on the bot shows you, here are all the different preferences that you can fill in, and here's the syntax. And then when the API will also pass that in, so whenever it sees that /preferences, it'll know to update those preferences, or if it's the first time, it'll save those preferences. So otherwise, coffee time, if those preferences are set, it will always read those preferences from the database, and if it's the first time they're being passed in, that it will set those preferences, or I guess you can update those preferences as well.
Yeah, makes sense. And then again, this is where the whiteboard comes in handy, because if we had written this out, we'd have this in mind. So where do you persist these preferences? Like, is the in the database? Is there a separate schema? Is there a big, because I'm making the gestures. We got the nodes for our scalable system, and each one has their own sort of database that goes with it. Do we have a sort of global database outside that stores preferences? Do preferences go with the sort of coffee transactional database? What do you think?
Yeah, I would say it's same database, just different schema, and a schema that has, the different preferences in it. So each, basically the different table that has its own schema, right? So each table would be, this is coffee transactions, or coffee, basically inputs, right? They're coffee confirmed, right? Like it's actually happening. You're gonna have user IDs in there, and then user preferences, right? Which has user preferences would have a belongs to user ID's relationship with the user IDs, which would have, I think, yes, the user preferences would belong to the user IDs, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is where I keep saying the whiteboard. This is why being able to doodle comes in handy, because it's very difficult to keep all this in our minds. Because I am sure this is where, and this is where my own lack of practice comes in. I am sure with very experienced candidates that there is a trade-off with where the database lives in relation to the service, whether we're joining on every request, whether it's cached, whether like what sort of database we use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like I'm sure there's a lot of trade-offs there as soon as we start to add additional stuff than just, matching 2 and 2.
Absolutely. This is an area where the closer we get to the database, the more my ignorance and inexperience comes in, where I go, oh, we'll just do this. And it sounds great. And this is where my, the folks I work with, my lead would go, oh yeah, that's going to be pretty tough. We're doing 3 database calls for every 1 API transaction. I go, okay, well, let's figure out the best way to do this.
Yeah. We got the API and then blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll just make a whole new database for this. We don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. One other hypothetical feature request I wanted to throw at you is because I talked about preferences, the store, or the team, the which coffee shop you prefer. Let's say the CEO wants a one-off system where she alone can request a match with a person. So the CEO will sort of wait off to the side until this person is ready for coffee, and then straight to the top, the CEO and that person go out to coffee. Where would we put that? How would you think about implementing that?
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think I think we could still use the same type of API request. Again, if it was just a different parameter we're passing in, like, CEO key or master key, right? That, and then they would need to pass in the specific person, right? Or someone that they wanted to request to. So that ID, I think the part in my mind that is more like, oh, I don't really know how we would do that is then we have to generate some type of process to send that person some type of, hey, you're being requested for coffee, right? And then they would that would be a whole different flow than anything else we've done. But as far as like where would they be stored, I guess we could have some type of, that's interesting because everyone else is one-on-one and they're coming in. Yeah, I guess they'd almost have to be held in their own. Would it kind of almost need to be a different database table as well, where we have basically CEO coffees, right? Where the variables are basically different that are being passed in. There's some type of individual. So then when they're stored in memory, essentially what we're waiting for is some type of confirmation from that person. So that other API request, that once something gets sent to that person that says the CEO wants coffee with you, they respond, yes, 5 minutes or whatever it is, then they get matched with the CEO. I don't know if I know the best way to do that, but it seems like there would need to be a new, either an addition to the API that exists and then some type of new response to the API based off of a certain parameter that's passed in, and then its own database table that holds specifically CEO coffees.
Mm-hmm. So you're going in the same direction that I went. I was thinking, because we only have one CEO, so for the first iteration of this special matchmaking feature, we could hard code it. So like, if username is CEO, other code path.
Yeah.
But where with the Slack bot, with like the Slack interface, Slack will only send the API requests that we agree on. But
Yeah.
some malcontent could use a raw HTTP request and say my username is CEO. So how would you how would you worry about security? What do you think we could do to try to make sure that it's actually the CEO that's making that request for special coffees and not some troll that's setting arbitrary meetings?
The intern.
The evil intern.
Yes. Evil intern who had to build this bot. Interesting. It's a good question. The master key or CEO key. And I don't know if I know how to do it, but I'm sure there would be a way to encrypt that key or some type of, what is it, GP something key, right? That there's basically a unique identifier, right? That could be passed in. That would only be approved on essentially their computer, and maybe their Slack, right? If we could build that process in. Or have some type of, I don't know. That would be my thought, is if that unique identifier, instead of just being CEO or master, right? CEO true, which is what I was thinking, just a Boolean, is it's CEO and then it's some type of unique identifier. I don't know how on the database we can represent that that's consistently correct, right? If it's some type of change, but that would be my thought, and I'm sure we could figure that out.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's I'm no security wizard myself, but yeah, I appreciate like you talk through it and you're like, I think this is the general approach. I'm cheating because I happen to know from Slack bots that there's OAuth flow between Slack and the third-party service. So there is some continuity where you don't just look at the username, you look at I think it's some sort of SHA hash that like says, this user is this user is this user, and it is coming from Slack. So we could do something like that. But yeah, even something as simple as a password in the body, basic auth, would probably be helpful as well. Anything to prevent that darn intern from wreaking havoc.
It's his last week, and he's out to show them who he is.
Yeah. Well, Taylor, with that, I have exhausted my my sort of exercise, so we can rap about it, or not. It's up to you.
Great. Whatever feedback you would typically share. I know in interviews, typically there's not necessarily a ton of back and forth, but I think that's an interesting exercise, and I think one that maybe got less in the weeds of like specific technologies than stuff like that in the past that I've done, which I think is actually useful, because I can give you the answer of I would use JavaScript to do this, but it's because I know JavaScript, right? And maybe Node, because I feel like all the Slack bots I've seen are in Node for some reason, but that might just be why, just specific Slack bots. But yeah, any feedback, or maybe general things to think of when someone is going through this type of exercise would be helpful.
Yeah, for sure. In general, if this were a real interview, generally we try to be like supportive and transparent and stuff, but generally our recruiter talent acquisition team will follow up after the fact and say like, this is sort of the feedback we got, just FYI. Try to be helpful without being rude.
Liable.
Constructive criticism. Yeah. Well, that's true. But yeah, I was jotting down notes. Like if you're interviewing for real, I love that even if you weren't sure how to do it, you sort of talk through the approach. And even though the details weren't there, the spirit was there, the target was correct. So much of the discussion I don't think this is official, but so much of the discussion is often. Sorry, let me start over. So much of the perception of performance in these technical interviews hinges on vocabulary. So like the fact that you could rattle off, some buzzwords and some technologies and stuff, like I said, I don't think I know it's not officially in any sort of rubric, but for an interview where it's like, well, if this person said Node, then, if this person said MySQL, then they must know something. Being conversational about the technology played in your favor. And I think through our exercise, I hope you could see that like a super senior engineer would have done something similar already, and they probably would have rattled off like, oh yeah, I'd use this database for a queue, I'd use Kafka, I'd do this, I'd do that, because they'd walked the path already. They would be able to just rattle it off and then get straight to the edge cases and the trivia questions and the stranger stuff.
Yeah.
And then in our conversation, just I guess because it was on my mind, we talked about security a couple of times, which, like I said, I am by no means any sort of security expert. We have a team for that at ActiveCampaign, but I found that productive to sort of back and forth on that, because we were both sort of in the dark. It gave me confidence that like we could figure this out together.
I love that world. There's a Darknet Diaries is a podcast I listen to a lot, and it's basically a guy who was a security researcher for like 10, 15 years, and then started this podcast about all these like really interesting. Some of them you've heard of, and some of them you'd be like, I had no idea that this happened. Just these big hacks or they're kind of crazy events. And so security is always on the top of my mind. And the more I listen to the podcast, the more I'm like, I don't ever want to work in that world. But it's really interesting to hear the aftermath, as long as I didn't have to be involved. Right.
Yeah.
So I always think about it and try to pick anything up from that podcast of like, is there anything I can just keep in mind when I'm coding something? I'm like, oh, no one will hit the inspect element button and try to be malicious, right?
Yeah. The security-minded people are a paranoid bunch. And to their credit, though, like there's ways that things have been exploited that I couldn't even imagine. But they get in there and they tinker. I googled the Darknet Diaries. This looks like a very cool show.
Yeah, it's great. Jack Resider, I think, is the host, and he does a really good job of like building an interesting narrative while also interviewing people. And sometimes you're like, how did you get this person who's actively being investigated for this crime on the show to talk about how they did it? Right? Which is like crazy.
That's awesome. So cool.
Cool. Well, anything else?
No, this was a lot of fun. Hopefully this is helpful for somebody out there. At the very least, it was helpful for me to get all my thoughts together and talk to you about it. It was exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a blast. Thanks so much for being on the show. Before we close, anything else to share, anything to plug that I think ActiveCampaign is hiring, right? You're in those growth phases?
Yeah. ActiveCampaign is hiring. Use my own advice against me and hit me up. Send me a message on LinkedIn. Even if you're not a fit, I'll talk to anybody. If we're not hiring you now, we might hire you in the future.
And you just got the study guide for what a potential interview might look like in some way, shape, or form. So there you go.
Yeah, now our recruiting team's going to be all mad. We're going to have to make a new exercise because I just gave it all away. Well, luckily, I was not very good at it. So
great. Well, thank you so much. It was a blast.
Thank you, Taylor. Yeah.
Thank you for watching the technical interview portion of the Professional Technical Interviewee. If you want to tackle this interview question, you can find it at github.com/professional technical interviewee. New episodes are released on the first 4 Thursdays of each month. Find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Taylor Dorsett or on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. And remember, keep practicing.